Now for my first guest, who has a piece in tomorrow's Australian on the trans madness that has afflicted the media, certain medical circles, and seen any questioning of the merits of allowing children to transition deemed unacceptable. Writer and founding editor of Quillette, Claire Lehmann, joins me from Sydney. Claire, fantastic to have you with us.
Thanks for having me, Rita.
Now, why is this topic become almost taboo for much of the media? The Age even disappeared a piece on the weekend written by a parent of a trans child because they deemed it not sufficiently supportive of the trans movement.
Yeah, I think what's happening, Rita, is that ordinary people are afraid to discuss this issue because they don't want to be seen as prejudiced or lacking in compassion for kids who are suffering. And I think there's a perception that trans kids today are somewhat like gay kids were a generation ago. And we all know that gay kids suffered and they struggled to come out of the closet. But the problem I have with that comparison is that what's happening to trans kids is they're being subject to experimental medical treatments. And, you know, nobody wants a kid who's in distress to suffer more distress. But the problem we have is that this issue has been hijacked effectively by trans activists who are pushing experimental medical treatments. And what I mean by experimental is that, take puberty blockers, for example. Kids that are put on puberty blockers, the drug that makes puberty stop in children has never been tested on children in what's called a randomized controlled trial. There aren't longitudinal studies showing that that drug is actually safe for children going through puberty. The only study data that we have comes out of a clinic in the UK that was recently taken to court by a woman who regretted transitioning. And the data from that clinic's own study showed that bone density in children declined. Well, it didn't exactly decline, but it didn't increase in the way that it's meant to during puberty. So what's essentially happening is that activists are pushing these treatments as if they're safe, and we don't know if they are, and if any questioning of these treatments is automatically transphobic. So it's a complex and sensitive issue, and I don't think it should be hijacked by activists.
No, and any criticism or even fact-checking of some of these false claims that are put forward by activists is automatically deemed hateful. But meanwhile, we have irrational, dismissive and even really error-riddled pieces like this published in Foreign Policy. That's it there. And these pieces are not only embraced by the activist class, Claire, but also worryingly by elements of the medical profession working in that area. They appear to have become captured by the ideologues, and rather than focusing on the science and evidence, it's almost a form of activism.
Yeah, and what I've noticed is people, whether they're medical professionals or journalists or editors of newspapers, are petrified of the trans lobby. They are petrified of being called transphobic. They're petrified of being called a bigot. And I think this fear that people have outweighs their concern for kids. Now, I'm a mother and I've got some scientific training, and I know that there's a line. You don't put kids on experimental medical treatments unless you have sufficient and robust evidence that shows that it's safe and the long-term outcomes are going to be beneficial for that kid or that person. And so this is why I'm now speaking out about this issue, because I see so many people being utterly cowardly, and they might think to themselves that a cautious approach is probably best, but they're too afraid to say it in public. And I think that's a problem.
Well, you can understand, though, Claire, I agree it's a problem, but you see the reaction and you see how people have had their reputations destroyed. You've seen honours removed. You've seen, you know, even someone, J.K. Rowling is an example that is used often because she is of the left. She's so supportive of the LGBT community as a whole, but she thinks that you can't just say identify as a woman. There's, you know, womanhood and spaces for women and girls should be protected. And just because she deviates on a couple of those points, she has absolutely been maligned. She's had her books banned from certain bookshops, and you search for her now, and transphobe, TERF, anti-trans, those slurs are now attached to her name. So you can understand, I guess, why there is this reluctance for people to comment or even report on this in a balanced way, because the vitriol that comes at them is really unhinged and ugly.
That's right. The trans lobby is very effective at what it does, and trolls online and people sending threats on behalf of the trans lobby can be very vicious. But I think there's more people in the world who care about their kids and who care about children's health and who want to protect kids than there are people who are afraid of being called transphobic. And I would suggest that people start looking into this issue and speaking up. It's not good enough that we can't have a debate about this topic. It's not good enough that we are simply supposed to accept that children can be subject to experimental medical treatments without dissenting viewpoints being discussed in our mainstream media. It's just not good enough. And I would suggest that people who are curious or concerned about this topic look into it. There's a lot of balanced information out there. My website, Quillette, has been covering this topic for several years now, and Bernard Lane, a journalist at The Australian, has also been covering this issue. You won't find any dissenting voices at the ABC, but there is more balance being brought into the debate. A recent High Court judgment in the UK, I think, has been a watershed moment. The High Court in the UK determined that children aren't able to give informed consent to puberty blockers because they're not able to properly weigh up the costs and benefits at a young age. And they've effectively put a halt to the use of puberty blockers in the Tavistock Gender Clinic in the UK. And I think this is an important moment in this issue, but it hasn't been reported on at the ABC. I'm not sure if it's been reported. I think it's been reported by the Sydney Morning Herald, but not by the ABC. Now, that's concerning.
That is hugely concerning, because they cover this story fairly consistently, but always from the activist point of view. That's right. I mean, never mind balance. I mean, the High Court decision is just a straight news story. They should be able to do without the hysteria. Do you think that judgment will have any impact here in Australia? Because we haven't had that moment. We haven't had that challenge from someone who's gone through the process and said, wait a second, this was a terrible mistake. I wasn't old enough to consent to this treatment.
It's an interesting question, and I'm not sure if we've got a clinic in Australia that can be compared to the Tavistock Clinic, where hundreds of children went through and were put on puberty blockers and then cross-sex hormones. From what I'm aware, the professionals in Australia do balance the risks, and there is a more cautious approach. However, if the activists have their way, a cautious approach which balances risks will be swept away, and there'll be an anything goes kind of approach where anybody who rocks up to a clinic has basically written a script for testosterone and out the door you go. And I'm not exaggerating. I've looked in to the models of care that are advocated by the activists, trans activists, and they advocate for getting rid of gatekeepers, for making puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones and even surgical interventions basically available like a consumer product. It's terribly concerning. If the activists get their way, we will have a similar situation in Australia where we have hundreds of children going through a clinic and doctors basically being lax in their duty of care. I'm not aware of that happening at the moment, but we have to remain vigilant.
Absolutely. Claire Lehmann, thank you so much for your time tonight.
Thanks for having me, Rita.